This lecture is about speaking in public. For many people, the idea of public speaking, giving a talk, making a presentation, etc., is rather scary, and it brings together a number of different types of fears. For instance, you might have a fear of fainting, of losing your voice, or even throwing up. You might be scared of just being boring, making a poor impression, or just appearing a little bit stupid. You might be worried about blanking out, forgetting, using the wrong words, making grammar mistakes. Or more fundamentally, you might be scared of just being judged. Even if you don't consciously understand these fears, your body understands, and it can often result in something called stage fright, which is basically the inability to perform and give your speech. These fears all have their roots in positive and negative face, which you already know about. Positive face is our desire to be part of something bigger and to contribute to something larger than ourselves. Negative face is our desire not to be coerced or not to be forced to do anything that we wouldn't normally do. Public speaking puts both of these aspects of face front and center. Negative face is affected insofar as because you are doing the public speaking and you wouldn't ordinarily do it, you feel that you're being coerced into presenting in a way that you might not ordinarily do. Positive face is affected insofar as you're obviously making your public speech to achieve a particular communicative end, perhaps to persuade someone of something. And in doing so, in effect, making a request to people to understand you and to be persuaded by you, you are risking your positive face. Now, this lecture doesn't aim to make you a perfect public speaker. Public speaking is an acquired skill. It takes a lot of time to practice it and get it right. And there are entire courses that focus exclusively on the issue of public speaking. The aim of this particular lecture will be to help us understand some of the dynamics of a public speaking event, and hopefully, by understanding the context of public speaking better, you will be better equipped to deal with some of the challenges that public speaking brings us. Of course, there are a number of very practical things you can do to help you improve your public speaking, and we'll cover a few of these as we go along. Before I continue, I do want to emphasize that after this lecture, you will not be the perfect public speaker. Public speaking is a complex skill that takes time to develop, and there are entire courses that focus exclusively on developing public speaking. In addition, because public speaking is a skill, it can only really be developed through practice. Let's compare it to learning to play guitar or the piano. Imagine that you went to 10 lectures on how to play the guitar or the history of guitar playing, and which might include complex analyses of guitar music. At the end of those 10 lectures, you are given a guitar and told to play. How well do you think you would be able to play? Well, the answer is probably not all that well. And that is because we recognize that playing a guitar is a complex skill that doesn't only require head knowledge, but also requires practice, which is to say body knowledge. Public speaking is no different. You can go to many lectures about it, but ultimately, in order to develop the skill, you will need to practice. I want you to pause for a moment and to think about some inspiring speakers that you might know personally or that you've heard. I've put a number of people that I would consider inspiring speakers on the screen. We have Barack Obama, Malala Yousafzai, Steve Jobs, Oprah Winfrey, and Martin Luther King. They're all inspiring public figures. The question I'd like you to consider is what makes these or other public speakers that you've heard effective. Perhaps it would be a good idea to pause the video and to go and listen to some speeches by these people. So what are the characteristics of good public speakers? There's probably a list that is almost unending of things we could point out. However, here are a few that sprung to my mind. They are fundamentally respectful of the audience's time, trust, and patience. They are authoritative and sincere at the same time. And what this means is that they gain our trust because we understand that they know what they're speaking about. And at the same time, we believe that what they're saying is true and that they know it to be true. Good public speakers also explicitly and repeatedly reinforce a structure for understanding. They don't just say one thing after another, but that there is a narrative or a principle that seems to bind their talks together. For instance, Martin Luther King's famous speech, "I Have a Dream," is structured around repetition of the phrase, "I have a dream," after which he explains what that dream consists of. Other types of structures might be a narrative about personal experience. It might be starting at general and moving to specific issues, or it might be starting with an anecdote, which is a type of specific issues, and moving into more general ones. There are many ways of structuring a narrative. Good speakers also draw you in as the audience because they read their audience continually. This means that they know what they want to say and they know what message they need to get across, but they are flexible in the way they do it, and that they adjust their style and words according to what they think their audience needs. And this means they need to be very perceptive about the mood of the audience. Ultimately, these things all come together to create a persuasive speaker. What are characteristics of poor public speakers? At their core, I think poor public speakers don't respect the audience's time and patience. They either don't bother or they are not empathetic enough to be able to read the audience and respond to the audience's needs. This means that they tend to be inflexible. They have a plan of what they want to say, and they push on saying it no matter what. An example of inflexibility occurred, for instance, when Colonel Gaddafi, who was then the leader of Libya, instead of taking 15 minutes at the United Nations General Assembly, harangued the audience for several hours. As the speech was being translated by human translators simultaneously, this was incredibly exhausting for the translators, and it is reported that Colonel Gaddafi's own translator actually fainted because of the exertion. The message this type of behavior sends is that as a speaker, you haven't prepared enough to know what you want to say and to be able to say it succinctly, and that you don't respect your audience. Poor speakers tend not to structure their speeches in a way that is easily accessible, and they jump around from topic to topic, and they rely on the hearer to make sense of it, rather than structuring their talk in a way that makes sense of it for the listener. Another way of thinking about poor public speakers is that they demand your attention rather than earning it, and they tell you what to think without attempting to be persuasive. In this lecture, we will be dealing with some of these issues. What makes this lecture different to other talks about public speaking that you might find on the internet is that we're not going to focus almost exclusively on tips, tricks, and techniques that might get you through a public speaking event. Rather, we are first going to try and understand the dynamics of a public speaking communicative event and all the expectations that are around it. Then it is easier to focus on what you want to say and how you want to say it, and only after that, in the final instance, should you worry about gimmicks and techniques, whether to use a PowerPoint presentation or a Prezi, whether to use certain types of colors or an animation or prompt cards, etc. Let's look at understanding the dynamics of a speaking event. A communicative event involves a sender or an encoder and a receiver or a decoder. They engage in communicative contact that is appropriate to the relationship. For instance, if they are closely related, they might speak in a more familiar, colloquial fashion. If they are not related, or if they are in a power relationship to each other, for instance, boss and employee, then they might communicate in a more formalized way. Linked to this is the fact that the information that is conveyed is transmitted in a particular style and code, which is intrinsically related to the appropriacy within that context. All of this happens within some kind of shared context that also affects the way you might want to communicate. For instance, if you are sitting in a busy taxi, then that shared context will determine what you speak about and how you do it. For instance, because the busy taxi might be fairly noisy, you might have to speak in a raised voice that might be inappropriate if you are speaking to your partner in the silence of a bedroom. I won't go into this in too much detail because I'm sure you have encountered it before. So let's analyze your speaking situation in a public speaking event and try and work out how much of it is up to you to select. You are given a particular type of audience. Generally, you can't select who your audience is. You might be able to know things about them, to be able to make generalizations such as, my audience is probably in their late teens or early 20s. It has an even mix of men and women. It consists of people who are mainly South African and who have a common South African cultural heritage to draw on, but who may be linguistically diverse, that is, speaking many different languages. I can't control any of these things, but I need to be able to adapt to it. What you speak about, which is to say the topic, is also not always up to you to select. For instance, if you are part of a marketing team and you have to develop a marketing strategy for a particular product, it's not up to you to select what the product is. Most of the time, therefore, what we talk about is determined by the context. Where the public speaking event takes place is also largely not always up to us. It may be in a boardroom, it may be in a lecture venue, or it may even be on a video such as this one. When the public speaking event is also largely not controlled by us. For instance, even Barack Obama, when he has to give a speech to the Democratic National Convention, has to give it at a particular time that may not be his choosing. The goals of a public speaking event may also not be entirely up to you. To go back to our example about you being part of a marketing team, the goals of the public speaking event would be to sell the product or to convince the board to accept your marketing strategy. What is up to you, however, is how you go about giving your presentation. Your choice of the words and structures you use, your choice of the ideas that you want to convey. These are entirely up to you. It's also very important to be aware of the medium of communication. And before talking about public speaking, I'd like to briefly compare spoken versus written language. Spoken language is time-bound, which means that once you've said something, it has disappeared. You can't go back and find it again, or unsay something that we've already said, unless, of course, you record it. Spoken language tends to be unplanned and impromptu, and also tends to rely on informal styles and registers. Generally, when we speak in a conversation, it uses implicit signaling to an audience, and what we mean by that is, generally, we don't need to tell people what we're about to say. For instance, if I'm going to tell you a joke, and we're in a conversation, I generally don't start with, I am about to tell you a joke. The joke is the following. Rather, the way we'd start a joke, we might say something like, did you hear the one about, and then we might continue with our joke. This is possible because most spoken communication is face-to-face, or in some cases, ear-to-ear if we are doing it on the phone. We are aware who the audience is, and we are able to easily read the audience through a number of feedback mechanisms, such as smiles, nodding of the head, minimal responses like and aha, and we tend to be responsive to that audience feedback. Written communication is quite different. First of all, it is permanent or semi-permanent and transcends time. So once you have written something down, someone can read it in 10 years' time, or 1,000 years' time, or even 10,000 years' time, provided that the written record remains for that long. Because it is a permanent record, it tends to be highly considered, revised, rewritten, and edited so that its contents are crystal clear. Written communication tends to largely use formal styles and registers, and often needs to use explicit signaling to the audience. For instance, if you're writing an essay or perhaps reading a journal article, you might be familiar with the following kinds of explicit signaling, where in the introduction you will say, this essay will talk about X, Y, and Z, and in part 1 I will make a certain argument, and in part 2 I will counter that with another kind of argument. Part of the reason for this is that there's no control over who the audience may be. Anybody may pick up your essay or a book or a blog that you may have written and must be able to read and understand it. And because of that, we need to use language that they understand and to make our logic very clear. Of course, when we write, as the writer, you're probably not going to be present when your writing is actually read out, and so it's not possible to obtain feedback from the potential audience. That means as a good writer, you need to anticipate what the audience feedback might be. Of course, taking into consideration that the audience might be reading your writing in a very different context to which you wrote it. And having anticipated that feedback, you need to write in a way that can address it. This brings us to the medium of public speaking. Public speaking is a rather odd combination of both spoken and written language. For instance, like spoken language, it is time-bound and transient, but like written language, it is usually highly considered, revised and rewritten, and uses formal registered. Public speaking uses both implicit signaling to the audience as well as explicit signaling, depending on the context and what you want to achieve. And like spoken language, it uses face-to-face communication, so we know who the audience is generally, and because of that, there are feedback mechanisms that we can draw into and read, and we can be responsive to those. It is precisely because public speaking straddles the characteristics of both spoken and written language that it is rather difficult to get right. But like any type of communication, it does get better with practice. Now that we understand a theoretical model of public speaking, let's look at some practical hints, tips, and techniques that might assist you. The first of which is proper time management. You do need to be prepared, and that means that you need to practice repeatedly until the entire thing looks unrehearsed. Usually novice public speakers struggle a little with this, and they are not persuasive precisely because their speeches look and feel rehearsed. Personally, when I give a 15-minute talk at a conference, I can easily rehearse that 10 times or more so that I know exactly what I want to say, how I want to say it, and how long it's going to take. One of the areas where speakers tend to waste a lot of time is getting started. They might and ah and introduce themselves and read the topic of the speech, and all of this wastes time. So I would recommend that you memorize your introduction and the very first minute of what you want to say, so that when you get up, you say what you've memorized, which should be able to break the inertia and get you started, after which you might like to be a bit more flexible. Remember, time management is all about respecting the time and patience of your audience. The more prepared you are, the less tense you will be, the more confident you will appear, and the more persuasive you are going to be in the long run. Personal presentation really matters. Take the time to dress the part, both for your sake and for the sake of your audience. You may have heard about power dressing, sometimes getting dressed in a favorite pair of shoes or favorite set of underwear or a zooty outfit helps us feel more in control of a situation, and that means we're going to come across as a lot more confident. Also, dressing nicely tells your audience that you respect them enough to have made the effort. Try and make eye contact with everybody in the audience. Try not to zoom in on one particular person in the front row, but let your eyes wander over the entire audience from front to back, left and right, and back again. This also means that by looking at everybody, you focus on nobody. And this also means that you are less likely to get intimidated by one particular person who may be frowning or scowling or yawning or playing on their phone. Talking about distracting habits, try and avoid these for yourselves. Don't give a talk when you are chewing gum. Make sure you turn off your phone. Don't pick your nose, and please don't make snorting noises. A lot of people are also concerned about whether they should stand in one place or whether they may walk up and down. My advice is that it does depend on the context. You may walk if there is space enough to walk at the front of the venue, but make sure that you don't pace. This is all related to taking control. It's important to take control of the space that you find yourself in and to infuse your audience with energy. You have a right to be there, so let them know it. If it is a small space, for instance, at the front of a tutorial venue or behind a podium, then my advice is to stay put and use your voice and gestures to fill the space, metaphorically. If it is a large space, like a front of a lecture venue or a stage, then you can also take physical control of the space by walking, but again, make sure you don't end up pacing. You can also use physical gestures, and in some cases you may have capacity to use large audio-visual measures, such as a spotlight at a TED Talk or a widescreen presentation. All of these measures serve to take physical control of the space that you are given, and that will help the audience to recognize your own confidence and authority. Of course, being authoritative is all one thing, but you mustn't forget to read your audience and to take that feedback into consideration. In a way, when you are giving a talk, there should be two of you as one person. The one part of you should be doing the speaking, and the other part of you should be keenly observing, looking at people's facial features, feedback mechanisms. Are they nodding? Are they fidgeting? Are they smiling? Are they talking to each other and ignoring you? Are they playing with their phones? All of these things could give you cues about the effectiveness of what you're saying at that very moment. And understanding your audience and the context that you're working in will help you to interpret these cues. Most importantly, if you see that you are losing your audience, then change what you are doing. You may choose to speak louder, or you may choose to speak softer. You may speed up what you're saying. You may slow down. You might choose to skip over a point that you are expanding on, or you may choose to pause in the flow of your speech and include an anecdote or a personal experience to bring your audience back to you. Let's talk a little bit about visual aids. Please make your visual aids clear, simple, and not distracting. A lot of public speakers, even if they're quite good at the speaking part, often get seduced by the possibilities of PowerPoint. As you can imagine, PowerPoint allows us to do a lot of things with backgrounds, colors, pictures, animations, different font sizes and colors, but just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. The first step is to make sure that your backgrounds, while interesting, should not be overly distracting, and that the text on screen should be visible. Please make sure that the font size is as large as possible for the context that you find yourself in. And that means you shouldn't have a lot of text on the page. A lot of text just distracts people from what you are saying. Similarly, please make sure that your color presents a good contrast to the color of the background to make the text maximally legible, especially considering that there may be people in the audience who have a visual impairment and may find it difficult to read text which has a low contrast with the background. Also be careful of using too many different kinds of animations. Again, just because PowerPoint allows you to use animations doesn't mean that you necessarily should. Rather use a single style of font. The inbuilt PowerPoint styles are quite good. Make effective use of pictures and restrict your text to a few points and avoid lots of text. Here is an example of a slightly better PowerPoint screen. Note that we have one type of font that is differentiated by bold versus not bold. The font size is as big as possible. And font colors are used in a way that enhance visibility. You will also notice that we structure the presentation of the text so that each block of text comes into focus at a different time, and color can be used to highlight or de-accent different parts of the text. You'll also notice that we have grouped the text in a particular way. In this particular slide, we've divided into fonts, visuals, and texts. And in each case, we've used a simple animation form combined with color to highlight the point we want the audience to focus on. In conclusion, remember that public speaking is a skill that needs to be developed, and like any skill, will need practice. We have also looked at the theoretical underpinnings of what constitutes a communicative event and how public speaking can be analyzed as a communicative event. By doing this, we have been able to identify what makes public speaking particularly challenging. And it is this understanding that will help you with practice to become a better public speaker. Finally, we've covered a very few do's and don'ts to help you get started. Enjoy your practicing and good luck.